The Equitable and Inclusive Educational Practices, a reflection by Alvaro Roque. To understand the school-to-prison pipeline, you need to understand the policies that helped create this thing. The zero tolerance and the biased enforcement helped fuel inequalities. Students often felt targeted, and that reinforced negative cycles not only in the classroom and in the school, but also within themselves and their self-worth. Although LAUSD has changed a lot of their policies and really are stepping in the right direction, there are a lot of rooms for improvement. For example, if staff inconsistently apply PBIS, in other words, if they are harsher to discipline certain groups, then these disparities will still persist. The policy that allows suspensions and expulsions for serious offenses are allowed also during these policies. If schools lean towards these as opposed to restorative options, then again, we are adding to the pipeline in a different way. And although school police is rarely employed within LAUSD schools, they can be, and that would cause issues within these students who are feeling targeted. Subjective and discipline categories that disappropriately impact students of color and students of disability were some of the more eye-opening aspects of this. My recommendations would be to expand counselors, to create more opportunities to bring in social justice coordinators. I think that schools and the district need to review their discipline data based on race, based on gender, and based on disability. Some of the ways that this has influenced my practice is essentially I will be focusing on relationship building and restorative conversations, that I address behavior, uncovering the root causes, not just getting angry at them, but trying to understand why they're acting up. Is it some sort of trauma? Is it something that they don't understand? Using a classroom social contract that I still use allows these students to feel like their voice matters, which it does. When restorative practices disappear, that's when students feel targeted, that's when they feel disengaged. Constant equitable practices help build and prevent escalation. And I think that moving forward, part of my growth will be self-reflection and opening up dialogues with students and parents and colleagues, and engaging in more PDs that are equity focused. Restorative practices can be very important in the classroom, shifting from punitive to restorative mindset, allowing you to focus on healing and building those relationships that are incredibly important, and focusing on accountability. When you're wrong, well, you're wrong. Realizing conflict often masks deeper needs, that these students need coping strategies for their trauma. In other words, if a student is acting up in class, that student probably doesn't hate you. They just don't know you. They're looking at you through the prism of trauma. Some of the case study takeaways were that punitive measures usually create isolation, they create resentment, and they escalate the problem to almost stratospheric heights. That to be restorative means that you create empathy, you create voice, and you repair a lot of these relationships and a lot of the trauma that these kids are dealing with. I understand that with every new thing there is some pushback, and that honestly you might not have equal participation. You may not have students that are super enthused to try to help, and the truth is you might not be able to address all power imbalances, but we keep trying. And we continue with check-ins, we continue with suggestion boxes, we continue with social contracts to give these students a voice. We plan to integrate restorative circles consistently to strengthen community. And me, I commit to a daily reflection, open communication with my students, and an equity-focused discipline. At some point this year, I plan to employ restorative circles in my classroom. I want to build empathy, belonging, and trust. I want to ensure that all voices are heard. I want to promote accountability, and I want to repair any harm that happened to any of the relationships in my classroom due to conflict. I will be creating circle seating where a stress ball will be used as a talking piece. Not only does it help you relax, but it's a good thing to pass around. That I would be the facilitator at first and give the students that power later. I would facilitate discussion by using questions such as, what made you feel proud this week? Can we repair harm and restore trust? What support do you need from others? Essentially, using a talking piece ensures that everybody has a voice. Modeling the I statements and validating emotion means that everyone else learns to do the same. Employ trauma-informed practices in your class means that you have to have a perspective shift, that you need to understand that the behavior is a way of communicating their unmet needs and trauma, that emotional regulation needs to be taught and modeled for these students, that as a culture, as a classroom culture, you need to build empathy, trust, safety, and that classrooms need to be a supportive area for these kids. It cannot be a punitive area. That honestly, you will have some pushback. You might have pushback from the kids you're trying to help. That these students might resist your strategies. They might resist this model. That if you created a quiet corner, that calm corner might be overused. So setting up times, setting up reflection sheets for that area, that you might not know what their emotional triggers are. So when that happens, you need to be flexible. You need to collaborate with counselors and families. That one way of collaboration is working with other staff, other teachers to figure out what the routines are, what the policies are. Regularly review data and circles and PDs so that you will become an integral part in trauma-informed care. This practice creates long-term impact. It helps students feel safe, supported in these classrooms where they feel valued, they feel cared for. Consistent regulation strategies, they are able to focus better, they're able to be more resilient, they're able to feel more like they belong. That cuts down not only on the behavior they have in class, but it allows them to succeed. Each class should have a trauma response plan. So daily check-ins with students as they come through the door, breathing routines as part of them working in certain groups and all that stuff. Having a calm corner where students can check out at least for 5 minutes and have a reflection sheet. A weekly restorative circles would also help. I've learned to look beyond behavior with my experience. I have learned to care about myself and my well-being. So in the mornings, I will meditate, I will journal, I will exercise to keep me not only present in my own life, but also in classes when I do run into these kids that have trauma, to be able to fully help them and be present for them. Also, having an awareness that sometimes that home trauma is the one that's creating their classroom behavior. That they have trauma far beyond the walls of the school, and that we need to respond with patience and not with punishment.
So cultural responsive teaching is a approach that allows the teacher to access prior knowledge, to give students the ability to understand that their own personal histories actually matter. Students engage more with history when they're able to use their own voices and their own perspectives. CRT shifts the learning from just memorization to this critical analysis and allows them to be more civically responsible, because this stuff is no longer in dusty books. It's something that is living, that is with them. A way to make, for example, history, in my case, far more interesting is to employ counter-narratives and multiple perspectives within a lesson to show the more kind of marginalized voices that exist. Creating a community through family history projects, oral stories, photo essays, digital stories to fill in the gaps that usually are left out due to our textbooks. The student-led Socratic seminars linking the past and the present, allowing their voices once again to take center stage. There will be issues, obviously. Sensitive topics in history will require self-reflection, will require debriefs. Will there be unequal access to family history because grandpa, grandma, dad, mom might actually not physically be here? Yes, that is a reality. But providing archives and alternatives to these histories might actually help these students understand that they're an important aspect of what makes history not only interesting, but important. Another issue might be balancing CTR with standards, but if you map out the CTR directly to a state standards, you will understand that it doesn't replace that standard, but makes it better. I believe that CTR actually builds stronger relationships. It validates cultural heritage, it fosters trust and respect. Kids come in and they want to share their history. It bridges the gap between home and school knowledge and allows families to see themselves within the curricula. We are constantly, as teachers, trying to challenge our own biases. We need to reflect on what our colorblind tendencies are and essentially ensure that multiple perspectives are part of our curricula. We need to avoid these assumptions that the reason that parents aren't involved is because they don't care. And we need to recognize these structural barriers that don't allow them to be part of our classroom. We need to listen when students actually do push back against the assignments. For example, a lesson on 9/11 doesn't really show the issues that Arab Americans experienced. I plan to continue weaving marginalized voices into my history lessons, seeking feedback from students on representation in the curriculum, and I'll commit myself to more PDs on equity, race, and essentially my bias. To be able to look at one's own school policies through the lens of equity means that you look at whatever policy you have and find out the holes that don't allow students or parents to connect with their teachers or with the school itself. One of those policies is the parent conferences at the high school where I teach at. Apparently, they are only limited to twice a year, and this creates inequalities. Because the assumption is that these low-income EL parents don't really care about their students, when the truth could be that these parents are working really hard, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, whatever it is, and they just don't have the time to go to school. Also, some of these parents do not speak the language and might not feel comfortable being able to discuss their students' achievements or lack thereof. Also, some of these parents may not have had a higher education and fear that they might not have the ability to contend with the school or the teacher. A way to bridge those gaps would be to increase the parent-teacher contact to more than just twice a year. Maybe offer flexible options like video calls, maybe varying the times, providing translators to help support engagement, and maybe build a stronger teacher-student partnership through phone calls from teachers to parents. The impact of equity reduces these harmful assumptions, and also it increases fairness and access, and ultimately student success. In order to reduce biases in a classroom, a teacher needs to reflect on their own. I reflected on one just this last week. I had been teaching how to write a paragraph, but allowed the biases of when I worked at a military school to shape my lens of how these kids were reacting to my lesson. I feared that these kids were going to react the same way that the military school kids reacted, these kids that had trauma. These kids were disengaging, not out of disrespect, but because they didn't understand what I was talking about. Biases skew responses, but the empathy that I built later, the very next day, allowed me to reflect and restore that trust by apologizing to them and redoing that lesson. My action plan moving forward is to pause, to breathe before reacting, to assume that these kids aren't trying to do things out of malice, and to check in with students. I need to follow essentially what I set up from the very beginning. The warning, the conversation, the support. These steps need to be paramount in my classroom moving forward. As a school, we also need staff training to build this bias awareness, to have regular reviews of policies and practices, and to incorporate restorative justice such as circles, meditation, reflection, to replace this discipline that kicks kids out of our classroom. We need to rethink classroom management. We need to understand that classroom setup and our expectations set up students for success more than their upbringing. That consistency, PBIS strategies, and social contracts promote things like fairness and trust and engagement in the classroom. That restorative and proactive strategies improve the student-teacher relationship and climate more than punishment. Yes, there are going to be some challenges to these, like it's going to be hard to follow through with so much workload, but using checklists and peer accountability means that the classroom will kind of take care of itself. That students are going to test your boundaries when it comes to these things, but you need to stay consistent and model what you expect from the class. That yes, there might be an over-reliance on rewards and students might want to act because they're going to get something from it. But there has to be a balance between things like husky bucks and intrinsic motivation like praise and ownership. And yes, are students going to disengage with the contracts? Of course. But if they feel, not only feel, if they co-create these contracts, if they review it every so often, if we celebrate these shared norms, then these become living contracts in your classroom. So why are restorative approaches far better than traditional discipline? Traditional discipline suspends and excludes the child from the classroom. It feeds into the school to prison pipeline. We know this. Restorative approaches, on the other hand, create reflection sheets, contracts, circles, and it fosters accountability and support and allows these kids to self-regulate and to become better humans. Moving forward, my action plan will be to create these clear expectations collaboratively in the form of social contracts. We will adhere to these things and understand that these things are living documents in the classroom. I will be implementing husky bucks gradually and pair them with intrinsic motivation. I'll use reflection tools that help these students become more accountable and be able to self-regulate. I will balance accountability with empathy. Consequences are going to be linked to growth and not punishment. I will embed these strategies into long-term practices and be consistent with my expectations, restorative routines, and community building. Ultimately, the vision for all of this is to build a classroom where fairness, empathy, and consistency cultivate engagement, reduce behavior, and strengthen not only the school classroom, but the school culture. Thank you for listening.